Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. This is my great pleasure to welcome you all today to this online discussion co-organized with our partners, Key Elements Group. My name is Roman Aquino and I am the Managing Director of Eurocreative, the French think tank specifically dedicated to Central and Eastern Europe. Today, I will be your moderator for this very timely discussion on Russian disinformation. A very interesting topic indeed, which appears more and more often in our headlines and in our public debates. But Russian disinformation is nothing new, isn't it? That's why our guest today will discuss Russian disinformation main features through different case studies from Ukraine to the Western Balkans, but also in the Baltic states and across the Atlantic. As we all know, the situation is very serious as the West is directly targeted by Russia through different types of hybrid warfare methods and means, which have a direct impact on our societies. It is therefore urgent to increase our collective resilience, and that's the reason why we are all here today. Identify, share, and comment ideas on how to counter and tackle those challenges together as allies and partners. But before all of this, let me please introduce our distinguished speakers today. Joining us from the US is Noah Kroloff, former Chief of Staff of the US Department of Homeland Security and currently Principal at the Global Security Innovative Strategies. Also from the US is Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Now from Ukraine, we have Pavlo Vernadsky, Managing Director at COSA Intelligence Solutions, and worth to mention, is also a member of the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions. And last but not least, from Lithuania, but in live from London, is Monika Bičkauskaitė-Aleliūnė, Director of Public Affairs at Key Elements Group. All right, let's speak about Russian disinformation and its main features. As we know, Russia has been spreading propaganda across the world for centuries. And if Russia is not the only country to have done so, they have some expertise in this field, to put it this way. So, Ivana, could you please tell us how does Putin's propaganda differs or not from the one used before his time? And is there some continuity? And do you basically see any particularities there?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today about this pressing issue. And even though there has been so much talks recently about Russian influence operations, this is really nothing new. Russia has been doing that for decades. The only difference that we see nowadays is the change in technology. So basically the use of troll farms and bots helps Putin amplify his messaging. The second difference, what we saw actually recently with the FBI report, is actually how Russia is adapting its strategy. So it's not only anymore about trolls and bots, it's significantly more a complex story now because they can use social media influencers. They are using their local media that is easily picked up by local bloggers. So the information environment is becoming more and more complex. And the reason why they have adapted strategy, it is because it allows the Kremlin to claim plausible deniability. So that's the first part of the problem. What is the difference when it comes to messaging? I also don't think that the messaging has shifted a lot since even the Cold War. I always like to make jokes that you can change just some dates and names and you will see a very similar messaging. For example, one of the most famous Russian disinformation campaigns during the Cold War was accusing the United States, specifically the CIA, of creating the HIV virus and spreading it deliberately to places such as Africa. Nowadays, they are using a very similar messaging, for example, related to bioweapons, again accusing the US intelligence of operating bioweapons, and even training migratory birds to specifically deliver weapons, to Russia. They have accused the US intelligence of extracting DNA during the COVID virus through swabs. and to use that to specifically make ethnic weapon targeting specifically the Russians. So you see things have not shifted a lot, but this is only one example. I can give you multiple more examples, which would take me like probably a full week of going one by one example. But their most important messaging for the West is actually to make sure that the West stops supporting Ukraine. And they know exactly, don't forget that Putin is not a military guy. He's a KGB guy. He knows exactly how to exploit vulnerabilities in his enemies. That's number one point. Second thing, it's so easy for Russia to launch an information war because they do not have to worry about rules. Here in Washington, D.C., we do have certain rules when it comes to fighting influence operations. So nobody should be surprised by all those horrible, dirty games that Putin has been playing for a long time. And for example, in the West, currently what is working is there are two things, portraying Ukraine as a corrupt country. The second thing is another disinformation campaign that they have launched is related to nuclear weapons, especially now with the West allowing Ukraine to hit inside Russia. So the Russian government immediately announced that they would change nuclear doctrine. And you could immediately see in Western media that apparently the World War III is around the corner. That the United States is triggering a new Armageddon, and you can already see, how some people in the West are actually peddling such campaigns about the World War III. I can go on and on, but my point here that how I would like to really end this thing: if the Russian military claims that they value 4-to-1 non-military to military tools, and if they claim that who has information superiority is going to win this war, we really, really have to start thinking about the current situation in the world through Putin's lenses. This war is about perception, and who has perception superiority indeed is going to win this war. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I am back online. My internet completely crashed, weirdly enough. So I'm back. So sorry for this. Ivana, you mentioned a lot of very interesting things, and I listened to the last part actually, but I'm very happy that you mentioned this kind of continuity. And now I will turn to Pavlo and ask more specifically about Ukraine. In France, we have this sometimes impression that the Ukraine war just started 3 years ago, and it's not the case. It started back in 2014, and as well as the disinformation, it's been a long time that Ukraine is suffering Russian disinformation. And I would like to ask you how has it evolved, basically, this disinformation from the beginning of the 2010s to today?
Thanks, Romain. And well, I would definitely agree with Ivana, by the way, that the narratives have not changed significantly for a long time. The technology has. At the same time, when we look specifically at Ukraine, prior to 2014, I would even say prior to maybe 2005, Russia saw Ukraine as fully under control and in its zone of influence. And it pretended playing an ally. However, if you look at 2005 and further, certain narratives destroying or harming Ukraine's image internationally were spread around the gas issue. If you remember, the Russians blaming Ukraine of blocking the gas transit, which wasn't always technically possible at all, so that the Europeans would see Ukraine as a threat. So the simple thing about Russian uh, information warfare is I don't want to sound banal, but the simple thing is that their two main concepts are exactly what George Orwell wrote in his 1984: war is peace, slavery is freedom, ignorance is strength. Uh, and the second one is divide and rule. So, two main concepts. The first one means that they would turn everything upside down I don't want to refer to biblical concepts here, but it's exactly the evil described in those concepts. So turning everything upside down and being first in this. So if you look at how they spread the message, they usually say in a very negative tone. They blame their counterparties in a very negative tone of something they actually did. So it might sound funny, but in a world that lacks critical thinking, that works quite well. And unfortunately, this is one of Russia's allies globally, lack of critical thinking, and we can see that through many other aspects, political, business, and others. Second one, divide and rule. Well, obviously means they are trying to split societies. They are aiming at dividing dividing the unions built for the benefit of the global security, basically. If you look at what they're trying to do in the European Union, playing with certain national narratives to just or so national narratives to split the united kind of organization. They're even aiming at splitting the United States, basically. So these are the main concepts. In Ukraine, they're obviously using the constant political crisis, uh, adding a lot to the political crisis to even take place. They're playing with economic disorders, and obviously, as a society that is influenced by many different negative factors internally, are easy to manipulate. It's easy to manipulate. With the Ukrainians, though, it doesn't work that well, since in our minds, and I think I can say for the majority of the population here, obviously there are exceptions, unfortunately, and some parts of the country are still influenced by the Russians, unfortunately. But the majority probably has already come to a point where anything said by the Russian side is clearly a lie, considered as clearly a lie. However, more sophisticated and complex methods are still in place, and still people might not differentiate one from another, since you can see all those fake websites, fake polls, pretending to give you results about support of one party or another party, one candidate for presidency against another. Absolutely fake things. The interesting point here is that they really don't see a problem in inventing stuff fully out of the blue. I mean, I will refer to Ivana again. She said that in the West we have they have the kind of some rules, right, in this game. The Russians are totally out of any rules. They would invent things. I remember from 2015, I think, when they still had live news. They had a guy, the chief editor, I guess, who not the chief editor. They had a full division responsible for making up news, and so that wasn't journalism, right? So that was basically create a creative division, a creative unit within a so-called media. So they invented things and they presented them as something real. So that is a constant. That is a huge machine, and that works internationally. So when we say about influencing Ukraine, it's not about influencing only the society in Ukraine. It's about turning everyone else away from Ukraine, around turning all the support away from Ukraine, using the thin points within every nations and countries, problems, and using absolute lies. So they've brought this methodology to absurd. That's very important to understand when you might think that, no, that's impossible. Crucified boys, if you remember these things from the 2014, 2015. No, they would use absolutely absurd things to push their narrative forward, uh, uh, using the lack of critical thinking in this world.
Mhm. Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to Noah in the US. Noah, you were Chief of Staff of the US DHS back in 2013. And I would like to ask you a bit also on this evolution of the Russian disinformation, but this time in the US. Pavlo mentioned that, the Russian disinformation even tries to split the US, for example. Was it the case when you were at the head of the DHS? Has it evolved? What is the situation now?
Well, at the risk of aggressively agreeing with Ivana and Pablo, I think they're both correct, and I think their analysis is exactly right. I think the difference between um, 2013 or 2012 and 2023, 2024 is just the rate of acceleration by which the Russians are able to go direct to consumer using platforms that are accessible and easily manipulated. And I think if you it doesn't take a lot of study to look at Vladimir Putin and understand that one of his philosophies is that you want to look at your adversary's strength and neutralize that strength. And I think in the case of the United States and the West in general, one of our great strengths is our ability to freely communicate and express at least in the United States, our First Amendment rights to free speech. And um, the search and social media platforms that are now so exploited for foreign intelligence operations in the United States are very vulnerable platforms for that. And I do think that um, while Russian intelligence as has previously been said, have long run information operations with similar messaging that we see today. The real difference is the directness to the consumer that these platforms allow. And the real problem with that is that over time, over a decade in time, what gets created are unwitting intelligence officers, meaning people that have been fed information that they don't know to be fake, that they then start to act on because they believe it's a part of their community or they believe it's a part of their newsfeed network. And then you have innocent people wrapped up in information operations by foreign adversaries, particularly in the United States and certainly in the West. And I think what's doubly pernicious about all of it is, as we all know, one of the key message points is to cause the public to have a general disbelief in our democratic institutions and our governments that are duly elected by the people. And as you see an erosion in the faith in democratic institutions, you see a further destabilizing of society, and that is obviously the objective of Vladimir Putin's information operations and bot farms and everything else that they use on these platforms. And so that is very different today than it was in 2013, because I think in 2013, the technology was not there. The accessibility directly to consumer was just beginning to evolve. And the use of these platforms, while significant in 2013, nothing like it is today. And people still in 2013 more often than not got their news from proper news channels and newspapers and the established media platforms that existed back then. And today, I think it's just the opposite. The vast majority of people get information from non-information verified sources, and they then act on that. And that is exactly the playbook that that the Russians used back in 2013 in Crimea, and it's the exact playbook that's playing out across all of our Western and our democratic elections currently. And I think one of the things that we have to do as responsible leaders is uh, really focus on helping people to understand what is real and what is not real. And I think that's one of the great information battles of our current day and age is how do we, as public policy leaders or as think tank leaders or as government leaders, how do we help the public better understand information sources and what is real and what is fake and what you can rely on and what you can't rely on. And I will just conclude by saying, a decade ago, I think people often, at least in the United States, would look at you like you had two heads if you maintain that there is this information operation occurring across all of these platforms designed to destabilize our society. I think the good news is today, more people or fewer people would look at you like you had two heads if you said that. And so that to me feels like progress. The other thing I will say is US law enforcement and the US national security community is very aware and very attuned to this. And if, at least speaking for the United States, if our foreign adversaries think that we don't know what they're doing, they should think again. And there has been a huge evolution in where the FBI and where the US intelligence community and where the US national security community is going and how they are viewing this threat. So there is a new battlefront that has evolved, and um, I believe the United States government is up to the task, and I believe it will fulfill its responsibility to counter this. And I think that those who are trying to do this in the United States and across the Western world should take notice that we are not just going to lie down and let it happen.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to jump back to Europe and go to the Baltic states and ask you, Monica. Basically, Noah was just mentioning the fact that we have a new battleground, right? And generally, we say that one of the first trial example of hybrid warfare came from Estonia back in 2007 with massive cyber attacks from Russia. Could you tell us a bit more about Baltic states and how they've been facing, how you've been facing Russian disinformation over the past few decades?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Roman. So, first of all, I would like to emphasize that the Baltics are indeed a very important arena for Russian disinformation, and that stems from two facts. One is, of course, we have shared history of Russia, so it is easy to spread narratives around that. And second of all, we still have Russian-speaking minorities in these countries, and Putin feels like he can influence these people and try to spread disinformation via them because they might believe him more because of the connection of the language. And in the Baltics, we have a lot of types of disinformation, but because I would like to keep this concise, I would like to emphasize four of them today. So first and foremost, of course, there's the war in Ukraine, and there's a lot of disinformation around the topic in the Baltics. First of all, Putin is trying to scare the Baltics, saying that if you side with the West, if you do anything against Russia, you are next. And actually, at the beginning stages of the war, there's a lot of disinformation to the extent where some people actually were thinking or even did leave the Baltics countries because they were afraid that the war is actually coming very, very soon to the Baltics. And a lot of people even left the country because of this massive disinformation that we were facing. And another type of disinformation around war in Ukraine is trying to discredit Ukraine, saying that what they're doing in the battlefield is wrong, evil, and trying to discredit the leaders, the military and political leaders of Ukraine, saying that they are manipulated by the West, implemented by the West, and actually the West is the one driving this war. So we have a lot of disinformation around that. The second aspect of disinformation that also is very important in the Baltics is trying to discredit the West and Western organizations such as, for example, the EU, because you know that the Baltics are part of the EU and all of the policies implemented in the EU have to be implemented in the Baltics. So a lot of times disinformation stems from actual policies that EU is implementing in the area. For example, recently EU has allowed edible insects to be in food products in the EU. And there's a huge disinformation wave in the Baltics saying that EU is feeding you insects, you will die from these insects, you don't know what you're eating, etc., etc. So completely crazy stories were thrown around in the Baltics. And actually, this can be quite effective because it's a new topic, it's a sensitive topic, because when talk about social policies or policies that affect people's health, it's quite easy to manipulate people. And a lot of people did believe these stories. The third aspect in the Baltics that we see is personal attacks. So attacks on politicians and their character. And now, because we have election in Lithuania actually next month, we have parliamentary election. We as Key Elements Group, we use latest Ukrainian technology and we have tracked this information and we have seen how much it has been increasing actually in the run-up to the election. mostly targeting specific people and specific stories about them, planting different crazy stories and trying to smear their character. And the last aspect I would like to mention is quite old narrative, but quite effective narrative. And this narrative has been used in Baltics for decades. And this is the narrative of failed state. So basically saying that the Baltics are failed states, that they're run by Nazis, that they're incompetent, that people don't have enough money to buy food and cannot live there. And without Russia, these states will completely fail. So this is a very old narrative. And I think it's important to mention the fact that it has been first used in the Baltics and tested in the Baltics, but then we have seen the same narrative brought to Ukraine and then other countries as well. So when we're talking about the Baltics, it is important to remember that we have been kind of the test for Russia for disinformation. And all of the narratives that had been tested and have been effective in the Baltics are then being used in other countries. And remembering that, we can look at kind of the past narratives and know what's coming in the future in other countries in Europe. And because of that, the Baltic states, I think, are a very good example of how to look at disinformation and also how to counter disinformation as well. And just to get back to the point that Noah was making and Ivana was making, Pablo as well, everybody made this great point that yes, we have a lot of change in technology and it's evolving really fast. But I would like to emphasize that in the Baltics, we have seen rise in using of social media such as TikTok, Telegram, Instagram, and Facebook to spread this information. And why it's very effective, because in a way it can spread organically, because as I said, we have Russian speaking minorities. And if, for example, you convince them about this narrative, then they can spread naturally and organically as these people can share and create more posts around this. So it's kind of, Russia doesn't need to invest millions into people who will spread this information for them, because they can have people who do believe in this narrative and they spread it. And the last point, just really quickly, is that social media affects young generation as well. And this generation might not remember Soviet Union, might not have, as strong beliefs as, let's say, older generation that lived through that. And in the Baltics, I think that's the threat we need to look at, the young generation, and how to show them what's real and what's not, and how not to make sure that they don't go into this web of lies on social media, because it is a really easy tool to use for people to get lost in the narrative and not know what's right and what's wrong anymore. So I'll keep it to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And now from the Baltics to the Balkans, one of the region that we really want to understand more when it comes to Russian disinformation. Ivana, you've been working a lot on Russian disinformation in the Balkans region. I would
It's a definitely vulnerable thing for Moscow, so no wonder why Romain has just frozen. But I assume maybe I can just explain what's going on in the Balkans and why it matters. So, as Romain just said, I've been also following the Balkans, and given that there will be also elections in Georgia and Moldova, that I'm also following what's going on there, I have to admit that the script is very, very similar. But first of all, let me tell you the goals. Putin does not need to send tanks and jets to the Western Balkans. He doesn't care about occupying territory of any of those countries. What he actually needs the Balkans for is to put the Balkans on the brink of war and to distract the West from his war in Ukraine. That's number one thing. The second thing is NATO. One of the most vulnerable spots for NATO is actually the Western Balkans. Whether in places such as North Macedonia, that is becoming increasingly more pro-Russian, or Montenegro, that has also numerous domestic problems, or where NATO actually has peacekeeping mission, such as Kosovo, where last year 19 NATO peacekeepers were injured. All those things are actually vulnerable spots that Putin has been trying to exploit through proxies in the region to show that NATO and the West are actually paper tiger. And it's fascinating really to watch the situation there, because it's sad you can just delete like the name of the country and just replace it with other places, and to see that the playbook is actually very, very, very similar. So that's Putin's goal. But Putin would not be able to accomplish his goals without local proxies, including the president of Serbia and the Serbian government. whose ultimate goal is actually to stay in power. And that's why also Russian disinformation campaigns perfectly fit into President Vucic's narrative, who loves to escalate the crisis and then de-escalate it, and to claim that he's the pillar of stability. So the West has no other choice but to support him. So that's the big picture view. Now let's go back to see what's actually going on there. Monica said something immensely important, which is targeting the youth. And while the West, we are thinking oftentimes tactically and operationally about influence operations, Russia is thinking strategically, not about 2024, but also 2034. And that's why they are targeting the youth. I have never seen so much nationalism within the youth in the Balkans since the 90s. Believe it or not, as I said earlier in my remarks, how Putin is actually operating. He's also using social media influencers. That's one of his favorite toolkit in the Balkans, to take young, for example, people there, to fly them to Russia, to give them immediate training. They don't even hide it. You can find this information online. Ryber channel, a very famous male blogger channel, they actually also organized a media school to train people how to use social media influencers. Telegram is immensely powerful tool for Russia's influence operations there. And I always like to claim the reason why they are doing that, they're setting informational conditions before something happens so they can accuse the West. I'll just give you a very concrete example. Last year, before the Bansk attack happened in September, and before NATO peacekeepers were injured, there was a massive influence operations campaign on social media platforms, including Telegram channel, where they were setting informational conditions, claiming that the United Kingdom in particular is plotting a war there. Surprise, surprise, just a few days ago, they started a very similar campaign, again accusing the MI6 of plotting a war in Kosovo and preparing the assassination of the deputy prime minister, who just recently had meetings in Russia. Another thing, that they love to do is also to talk about color revolution, something that we recently saw in Georgia. The script is absolutely the same. And that's, something that's definitely nothing new. Another thing that I would like to explain is also how they're operating, just a big picture, because as promised, Romain, that this is going to be less than 5 minutes. So I do not want to be the one who is spreading this information here. But the way that they're operating in hybrid warfare, they do not really need, as I said, to send any jets. They're already accomplishing their goals. If you look, for example, in what's happening right now in Montenegro with the Serbian Orthodox Church and Montenegrin Orthodox Church, and how it has been polarized, it's exactly what Putin has been trying to do in Ukraine. That's number one thing. And let's not forget it's a NATO member state. The second thing is North Macedonia, with the new government and their policies that are relying more and more on Russian platform related to the name change of North Macedonia, related to their ties to Bulgaria and Greece. So there are a lot of disinformation around that. In Serbia in particular, the ultimate goal is to make sure that Serbia does not go with the West. So basically to demonize the European Union, and to talk actually that the European Union doesn't want Serbia over there, that it's a decadent place that is just promoting LGBTQ rights, and they're going to demonize the country. And that's the part of Russia's, in my view, one of the most important parts of their information warfare, which is the preservation of traditional and moral and spiritual values. If you look carefully at Russia's information security strategy and the latest foreign policy concept, including national security strategy, they make a special emphasis on preserving traditional and moral and spiritual values. I understand that for a lot of people in the West, they're laughing about those things, but it's the concept of communism was now replaced with that so-called ideology about the creation of a multipolar world. And as I said, it's about perception, whether they believe it or not. Truly doesn't matter. It is how they're actually weaponizing. And it's exactly what I see in Serbia, targeting specifically the far-right group with a similar context, especially related to the Orthodox Church. Another vulnerable point is the Balkans, is definitely Bosnia and Herzegovina, something that I worry more than anything else, because the polarization there has not just explained how Russia is operating here in the United States to polarize the country. That's exactly what they're doing in places such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, polarizing across ethnic, religious, identity lines. And for example, you do have the Serbian leader there, Milorad Dodik, who has been threatening with a secession. So, for example, every time when he's doing that, there is a inflow of memes on Telegram channels called RS Exit, means Republika Srpska Exit, similar to Brexit. So they have been flooding the information space, with such narratives. So in Serbia, in particular, when it comes to NATO, for example, they have been using a campaign to claim, that the United States has been using depleted uranium in shells, and it's exactly, I'm sure that Pavlo also noticed that, how they were accusing the United Kingdom of using depleted uranium in shells in Ukraine. So there is a lot of different aspects how they are actually using influence operations. But as I said, the ultimate goal is to make sure that the Balkans is not closer to the West, that is absolutely polarized and always on the brink of war, so they can escalate and de-escalate. Because think about strategy. Putin would love to position himself as a mediator and to tell the West, if you do not want chaos in the Balkans to spiral further, you will have to negotiate with me. That's, one of his key strategies. And the ultimate goal, the ultimate question that I would like to raise here is, how did we get there? Precisely because the West has abandoned a very important tool, which is indeed influence operations, to also put Russia on the defensive, but also to promote through media the truth about whether, democracy, European values, American partnership. So it just really tells us all we need to know, how it is also important, in addition to exposing all those influence operations coming from the Kremlin, that it's also important to put the Kremlin on the defensive.
Thank you. Very powerful words. And basically what we wanted to do also in this seminar, in this webinar, is to really try to identify the different similarities between the countries when it comes to Russian disinformation, because this is the best way to prepare to, counter and tackle Russian disinformation, is to know exactly what we are facing. And the truth is that we are facing it collectively. And Pavlo, I wanted to ask you to maybe wrap up and regroup the different similarities we've seen and start to answer, how do we get it from here? What do we do collectively to fix the challenges that we are facing together?
Well, the differences depend on certain historic aspects, I believe. Like in the Balkans, it's very clear that there is still a sentiment among Serbs mostly about Russia, which they, at times, even the youth. Sometimes I worked with Serbs for quite a while, so I've touched upon that. But even the youth, sometimes you can hear things like "Mother Russia" from them, and things like that, which is a fully it's quite a foolish sentiment they have from somewhere, from the back of their minds. Fully perverted kind of historic facts and misunderstanding of how Russia actually acts when you're closer to them, because the Balkans are lucky to have no border with the Russians, so they cannot, so the Russians cannot use their force in full, and they still need to refer to those older things. When you speak to Serbs these days, some of them, obviously, about Russians bombing Ukrainian cities, you can hear a counter argument saying, well, the NATO bombed us. Uh, no one wants to even think of why that happened and what was behind it. So the Russians are playing with that now, with that sentiment. I think Monica outlined very clearly what's the sentiment or what's the ground for this propaganda in the Balkans. So in Ukraine, we are unlucky to have a very large border with the Russians, and despite being in one country several times, we do not have, as Ukrainians, we don't have that kind of sentiment as in the majority about, some historic ties, etc. Because the moment bombs started falling, all those sentiments disappeared. You could still see people in 20, I think something like 2010, cheering for the Russian football team in a Ukrainian bar, if Ukraine wasn't playing, obviously. So you could still see that in those times. This is absolutely impossible these days. So a reason for that is, frankly speaking, Russia's very stupid foreign policy, aggressive, not very strategic, and just based on force. They can and they do. That's the idea. So what we as the free world should do, first of all, again, trivial things, but we need to stay united. That's quite clear, I think, because if your enemy tries to divide you, what you can do is stay united. Quite simple, I think, as a concept. However, when you look at societies in the West, in Europe, in the United States, eh, I don't want to give all the credit to the Russians, so to say. When we're saying they're dividing, they are uh, you know pushing certain narratives that are um, ruining ties within countries uh, and unions. We should also look what we're doing ourselves, right? I mean, certain values that the West has always been pushing forward or uh, kind of promoting around the world. Uh, I think the West should remember them too. And we're talking to former U.S. diplomats from time to time here in Ukraine. They like to visit Kiev and share their views and things. And when you see the previous generations of Americans brought up on Reagan style of U.S. Values, you can see that this is shading away in a certain sense. And is that Russian propaganda? I'm not sure about that. That's also kind of an internal process, which the Russians are obviously using. So we shouldn't give them our own weaknesses to use in order to promote their narrative. When you see the Russians supporting the far right in Europe, and at the same time saying that the Nazis are running Ukraine and Lithuania, for example, uh, that's quite a funny thing. At the same time, the European policy gives, in certain ways, gives way to the far right to actually raise their heads, in to a certain extent, and the Russians are obviously using that. There are a lot of discussions about whether the Russians actually planned the Crimea operation from the very beginning, or prior to even the Maidan, or they just used the circumstances and they just used the situation. I think as societies in the free world, we shouldn't give them the weaknesses. We shouldn't give them the ground to use these weaknesses of ours. Um, the propaganda aspects, in a purely technological aspect, um, this is something hard to tackle when you are a democratic state and you have the freedom of speech, and someone simply using this for their own benefit, uh, which perverts the whole concept of the free society, right? So you start tackling it, so and it becomes a problem. However, here in Ukraine, when we are in the phase of a hot war with a lot of losses among soldiers and civilians, soldiers who were civilians just yesterday, by the way. Um, I think certain concepts need to be revised, and we shouldn't trade kind of our security for um, the values that some might not even uh, follow. In our case, I mean that there should be tools to block certain Russian channels of communication with the society, which has been successfully done, by the way. And there were a lot of, if you remember, there were a lot of talks in the West about Ukraine blocking certain TV channels, certain social media channels. And you know what? I think now it is very clear that that was the right thing to do. You just cut them off because, I mean, they have nothing to do with the freedom of speech. It's just, as I said in the first part of my kind of speech, uh, if your enemy builds its strategy fully on lies and turning over facts, why do you even give the ground, right? Why do you even give the ground? It's do you give the platform for communicating that? So
Absolutely.
some strong, just one quick thing, Roman. Strong moves need to be taken without giving up on democracy in general, of course. So, but strong steps need to be taken. We need to realize our enemy is just using the weaknesses we still have here in the free world.
Absolutely, and this is the challenge that we face all together right now. Um, we will move towards the more practical part of this webinar, and I want to basically warn that we don't have much time, so we can take maybe a few questions from the audience. And Monica, I wanted to ask, we recently saw the nominations for the Commission. The Baltic states and the Nordics, we have to say, should have been, granted the fact that they know very well about disinformation, countering hybrid threats. What basically, according to you, should we take from the Baltics? What experiences?
Yeah, thank you, Roman. So indeed, as you mentioned, the Baltics are leading the fight against disinformation in Europe, but also I would say broadly in the NATO alliance, the Baltics are really known to fight disinformation. And of course, there are some government initiatives or some more institutionalized initiatives, such as media literacy programs and different types of media trying to expose fake news, disinformation, and to teach the audiences. There are, of course, lectures in different universities and schools. However, a very important aspect I would like to mention that's, I think, most interesting for the audience to hear about as well while fighting disinformation is a civil initiative that actually started in Lithuania, but now is in all Baltics and spreading to other countries. And this type of organization is called debunk.org. This organization not only shows disinformation and publishes deep investigations, but also we have civilians called the elves, and the elves as antithesis to internet trolls. We all know what trolls do online. So they are fighting the trolls online. What they do, these are simple people, civilians, volunteers. They go online, they gather in groups in Facebook, for example, and they try to find this information and report it to, for example, Facebook, so that this information is taken down. So this type of initiative of civilians is acknowledged by the government of Lithuania, who is saying that this is alternative of fighting, for example, in war in Ukraine. This is alternative fighting because you're fighting a really important war, information war. And I think this is a lesson that other countries can take from the Baltics, from Lithuania, and we can bring it to other countries. We know that in the Balkans, for example, Kosovo is often attacked by Serbian disinformation, by Russian disinformation. We have been looking at it quite closely because it is similar to disinformation that you see in the Baltics. And for countries like that can really take these examples from the Baltics and try to become more resilient. Because at the end of the day, we cannot afford to have another conflict in the Balkans or in the Baltics. We already have a war in Ukraine, and if we allow Russia to proceed with disinformation in the Balkans and the Baltics, we can end up with another war in another country, and we can see these countries being manipulated into very dangerous positions. So I think that we need to think about the Baltic countries and try to increase their resilience, but also the Baltics are an example of resilience. So again, countries in the Balkans can really take this example and try to implement it. And I think with the leadership of the US, and of course, Noah can talk a bit more about it, we can also have a bigger initiative like this, a civil initiative that could help the Balkans as well.
Thank you. You talked about resilience. Pavlo talked about unity, and this is the perfect framing for Noah. Basically, how the West can become more resilient, and what is the role, according to you, Noah, of the US in this context?
Well, uh, I think first of all, resilience is the name of the game, and all different parts of the world have a different argument to make about resilience. I think, for example, the United States is an incredibly resilient country as it relates to responding to and recovering from weather events and natural disasters. Clearly, the Balkans are the cauldron of all of this Russian misinformation and intervention, and have been, as Ivana said, for a very, very long time. So all of the Russian best practices of attacking the strengths to increase vulnerabilities of the West have been played out in the Balkans for years. And I think that's true in North Macedonia. It's clearly true in Moldova. It's clearly true in even in Albania. I mean, you just go across the Balkans and you see the presence and you feel the presence when you're there doing work. I do think that the United States is not absent from this playing field. I do think that if you look at the ascension of North Macedonia into NATO, or the ascension of Albania into NATO, I think there is and will continue to be a strategic effort to be in the battle in that part of the world. Obviously, Kosovo and other countries are just on the receiving end of such an incredible amount of this interference. But I do think that we as the West have to, and I think this is being thought about a lot in the United States, talk about and think about more holistically what resilience means. Because I think in the past, we as the West have often expected the government or governments to step in and do everything and fix everything. And this is not a problem that is symmetrical, that easily permits of a straight government solution. I think, for example, the platforms should be held accountable for what happens on them. So Facebook, X, or formerly Twitter, Instagram, all of these are private US companies that have accountability in this space, and they are global, and they should be at the table, and they should be partners. And I think that Ukraine is a really interesting example of where you've seen a pretty remarkable application of public-private partnership to create really innovative solutions to help the Ukraine fight this war against the Russians. And I think that we need to be thinking more about that. I think that the United States is thinking more about that holistically as a nation. And as I said earlier, I have seen a real evolution in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years in the way the United States national security community is viewing these threats. As I said earlier, a decade ago, if you went into rooms talking about this topic, in the United States, were often looked at like you were nuts. And now in today's world, when you sit down, it's almost the first thing that people are thinking about. And so I think that really is progress. And I think, just going back to reference something that Ivana said, the use of social issues by Russia in its misinformation and interference campaigns is particularly designed to undermine Western strength and Western democracy, because what is very easily sold by Putin is that Russia is stable. He's been the leader for 30 years and is going to continue to be the leader. And look, the West, every 4 years, there's someone different. And how can you rely on, these governments that are always changing and you never know if it's going to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? And how can you rely on the framework of democracy to partner with while at the same time using all of these divisive social issues to try to mobilize and break off the youth to try to counter all of the associated freedoms that come with human rights and First Amendment rights and freedom of speech and everything else. And I think that is very much needs to be a focus area for the West. I will say it continues to be a topic of conversation across the U.S. national security community, and I think the United States will continue to be at the table. Trying to ensure that the Balkans are not destabilized, trying to ensure that Ukraine has the tools that it needs to fight the war that it's fighting, and while paying attention to what's happening in Asia with Taiwan and China, and keeping a close eye on the Pacific theater, because that's a whole different topic that's not for today, but is very much related to and germane to this conversation.
And I'm sure that this region in the Pacific will remain on the top of the agenda of many in the coming months and years. We have 4 questions, which is great because we have 4 speakers, but we have 2 minutes. So maybe what I will do is that I will try to share these questions according to which one can be answered by whom. And I will ask you again to speak not too long. For the simple reason that the webinar is not too long. So I will just read the questions that I received online, and then we can do a round of answers. The question for Ivana would be about Russian disinformation in the Balkans. Obviously, the attendee is asking if Russia is targeting specifically the Albanophone area and populations negatively, as well as it's doing positively towards the Orthodox world in this region. So if I understand correctly, the question is, there is this promotion of the Orthodox world in the Balkans by Russian disinformation, by Russian influence. Are they also targeting negatively, especially the Albanophone communities, populations, countries? The question to Monica is mostly about Moldova and focusing on the lessons learned that maybe Moldova can take, for example, from the Baltics when it comes to dealing with Russian-speaking minorities in this country. And Moldova is very important. Elections are coming very soon. The question to Noah is what could be done at the policy level to help the public to discern what is true and what is fake? It's a very easy question indeed. And last but not least, the question to Pavlo. Do you think that the accession to the European Union, to the Western Balkan countries, to Ukraine, to Moldova, will make it simpler for these countries to face and counter disinformation or not? Maybe we can start with Ivana.
So to begin with, the Russian government has the concept of something that's called the Russian world, where all the Russians would live under the same cultural framework. A very similar thing over the past few years has developed also in the Western Balkans, something that's called the Serbian world. It was officially announced a few months ago. And before that, even the current deputy prime minister announced that approximately a few years ago. So having said that, absolutely the same thing how Russia has been weaponizing the Russian world in its own neighborhood. That's exactly what I see right now in the Western Balkans when it comes to the Serbian world. And indeed, the Orthodox Church plays a very important role. Go back to the Cold War era and you will also see that even back then, the KGB has been using the Orthodox Church instrumentally. Even nowadays, A very similar thing is also happening in the Western Balkans, especially targeting the far-right groups, where the Orthodox Church plays a tremendously important role, especially in places such as Montenegro, where that issue is tremendously sensitive because of the polarization between the Orthodox Church, Montenegrin, and the Serbian Orthodox Church. So I would say that the playbook is absolutely the same that Putin has been using for the past 2 decades.
Thank you, Ivana. Noah.
At the public policy level, I think you're already starting to see significant changes in helping the public and the broader community in the United States, at least, to be able to understand and help think through and in most cases debunk information that they are receiving. And I'll give you two really good examples of what these public policy advancements are. I think you very clearly see and very deliberatively by the U.S. national security community releasing more intelligence than it used to in the past, so that the public actually sees what the government officials are seeing, and so it understands what it needs to be aware of. And I think we saw that play out very intentionally at the beginning of the Ukraine war. More U.S. intelligence was released to the public than at almost any time I can recall in my lifetime in public policy. The second thing that's happening, and if you're listening, you can see it happening in the United States, which is that U.S. national security agencies and U.S. national security officials are having different conversations with the community, and importantly, are admitting when they have made mistakes. Because part of what has led to people losing faith in our democratic institutions is that democratic institutions were held to an impossible standard. And I think that those democratic institutions now, at least in the United States, are beginning to realize part of helping people not be radicalized by information operations by our international adversaries is by reasoning with them and helping them to understand the landscape that they are seeing in their communities. And just a quick example of that is just 2 weeks ago, we hosted an incredible discussion on the campus at UC Berkeley with the leadership of the FBI and the private sector in the United States, including technologists and including public advocates, to talk about the challenges with lawful access for the FBI. That's a conversation that would never have been had 10 years ago on a university campus with the public, with the private, with advocates. That conversation would not have happened 10 years ago. They're happening all over the United States today. And I think that that is a direct reflection of a public policy making decision that was made several years ago to think through how we can do this differently and to understand, like I said earlier, this is not just the government's responsibility. We all have a responsibility to bear, and we all have to participate in this effort to ensure that our freedoms are not undermined and that our important world allies, all across the globe are also part of this conversation, and that we cannot leave anyone behind, which is why you have seen this strong commitment by the United States in Ukraine. You're going to continue to see the United States engaging in the Balkans. This is not just a United States problem, it's a world problem. And I think the United States public policymakers have really kind of come to understand that in the last 7 or 8 years.
Monica.
Yeah, thank you, Roman. So looking at the question about how to make sure there's no hate incited between Russian-speaking minorities and the majority of the country. So looking at the Baltics, I think the most important lesson was trying to integrate the Russian-speaking minorities, because they are as well living, in these countries, and they should be part of the societies they live in. So trying to make sure that they, for example, kids go to Lithuanian school, they learn the language as well, so that they speak 2 languages and they're integrated. That really helped to make sure that there is no vast divisions between these segments of the population. However, another very important aspect on the country level would be the fact that Lithuania is not dependent on Russia financially. We know it's part of the EU, and in some other countries, the situation might be a bit different. So, for example, in Moldova, of course, when the country is in a tough spot financially, when people are dissatisfied with their political decisions, that might be a bit more difficult to do than in countries that are part of the EU, integrated, and are developing in a really fast way. So I think there are two types of things to do. One is more social policy, but the other is a bit more statewide policy on economics and general dependency on Russia in different spheres of economy and life. So I think that would be the best way to go forward for Moldova.
And finally, Pavlo, about EU integration, membership.
Yes, I'll quickly cover the integration part, and then there is another very interesting question in the end addressed to me. I will slightly touch upon that in the chat box. So, as to the quick accession to the EU, would that reduce the Russian influence? Well, if we look at what the accession to the EU brings, is basically hopefully economic growth, then yes, we can hope for that kind of correlation that economic growth would lead to less vulnerability of the society to Russian disinformation, right? People feel better, people earn more, people live in an open society together with all the European nations. Obviously, they are less vulnerable. However, the Russian methods would also change, and if you can already see how their influence, how they're impacting the Europeans today, who are already in the EU, right? We can assume that in a transition period when people's well-being is getting better, at this point in time, that would be definitely less influence. But I think at this particular time, the Europeans might be influenced more. So we would be careful with that. When the Europeans living in the EU, and they might feel not as good in economic way, it is very easy for the Russians to start pushing the narrative that that's because of the ones you've just accepted. Very simple, divide and rule. And as to the question about should we restrict the pluralistic debate as an integral element of our Western societies in favor of blocking narratives from Russia, quite manipulative, I would say. However, definitely not. Pluralistic debate is critical in a democratic society. What I think is important, though, is investigating the channels of injecting propaganda into democratic societies while using their weaknesses, to a certain extent, weaknesses, and kicking out those kind of channels based on evidence through investigation. We should not forget about the hard power, so to say. Policy is cute, but it should also be accompanied by investigation. We can see that in the sanctions aspects, for example, right? It's not just blocking Russian business. It's blocking the Russian business that supports the war. And that is easy to investigate. Well, relatively easy to investigate. There is technology to spread propaganda. There are artificial intelligence technologies to build more and more accounts and social networks by the Russians. So there should be technology to counteract. Moreover, there is always someone behind that kind of propaganda. As I said before, Russians are inventing facts. So there should be people behind that. There those bot farms, as we call it. There are whole offices working for that. There's the whole Russian media machine with billions of oil dollars is working for that propaganda. So there's always someone behind. So do not misunderstand the pluralistic debate, which is crucially important for democracy. And letting a criminal into your door or backyard for a chat. Thank you.
That's a very safe advice. Thank you very much. It's already 6:11. I will try to conclude in 1 minute. First, sorry for disappearing from the screen 2 times. Never happened to me 2 times today. Just a bit weird, and I would like to apologize for that. And second, let me give a few thank you to first our audience. Many thanks for attending this discussion, for staying here, for asking very interesting questions. Second, a big thanks to our distinguished speakers. It's been very nice to understand more from different parts of the world, different parts of the West, the different experiences, the lessons learned. And if we want to conclude on 3 different things, I guess, that the lessons to stay resilient and to face this disinformation threat from Russia are: first, understand yourself and your society better; second, try to improve your knowledge about Russian narrative; and third, stay united. And on this, I would like to thank our partners, Key Elements Group, for the organization and the cooperation on this webinar, and in particular, Monica. Thank you very much and see you soon.